Hola, mister. Victorio Calero en directo para Real Madrid Televisión. Mañana el Real Madrid se enfrenta a un Deportivo Alavés que está haciendo una buena temporada y que es un equipo fuerte en casa, en Mendizorroza. Pese a las numerosas bajas que tiene el equipo, ¿qué Real Madrid deseas ver mañana?
Buenas tardes. Pues evidentemente, a pesar de las bajas, tenemos fortalezas suficientes, tenemos equipo suficiente y mañana saldrán 11 al campo, 11 jugadores del Real Madrid a darlo todo. Estoy seguro de que las ganas, la actitud va a estar ahí y que el compromiso para poder ganar mañana el partido. Es un partido importante, nos viene en un momento antes de acabar el parón. Tenemos los 3 últimos partidos y mañana los 11 que salgan van a dar lo mejor.
Hola, Xavi. Antonio Mola, Radio Nacional de España. Hemos visto que ha entrenado Kylian Mbappé. ¿Está para viajar, para jugar? ¿Qué plan hay? Y el resto también de los tocados.
No, recuperamos a Kylian, está bien para jugar y mañana veremos, mañana decidiremos y eso es una buena noticia, evidentemente.
¿Qué tal, Xavi? Martín de Oquí Diario. 2 derrotas seguidas en el Bernabéu, se habla mucho de ese ruido que alguna vez tú has mencionado aquí en rueda de prensa. ¿Tú mañana sientes que te la juegas en el banquillo del Madrid si no ganas en Mendizorroza?
No, siempre os digo que para mí lo más importante es el equipo y es el club, evidentemente, y mañana tenemos un partido muy importante por el momento en el que es. Queremos cambiar la dinámica de resultados y tenemos un rival exigente. O sea que eso es lo que nos jugamos mañana.
Hola, Xavi. Muy buenas. Miguel Ángel Díaz de la cadena COPE. Decía el otro día Courtois, después de la derrota contra el Manchester City, que tuvo buenas sensaciones en el campo, que se demostró que el equipo no está muerto. Quería preguntarte cómo, pese a perder, ¿cómo de importante fue las sensaciones, la actitud que tuvieron los jugadores en el campo el otro día? Si se puede llegar a celebrar, entre comillas, una derrota.
No, eso no. No, pero sí que hicimos muchas cosas bien. Ya analizamos, yo creo que en la rueda de prensa posterior al partido, tampoco es que hay que darle demasiadas vueltas al último partido, ya ha pasado. Pero hay cosas positivas que las vamos a necesitar a futuro y el futuro cercanísimo es mañana en Vitoria.
Hola, mister. Por aquí Alberto Pereiro, Onda Cero. Mira que tú ya conocías la casa como futbolista hace unos años. Quería preguntarte si tu idea cuando llegaste aquí ahora es exactamente la que tenías en la cabeza cuando aceptaste ser entrenador del Madrid. O sea, que este proceso o todo lo que te ha pasado en estos meses lo veías o lo imaginabas exactamente igual. Y si me va mal va a ser así, si me va bien va a ser de otra manera. ¿Qué tenías en la cabeza que iba a ser la primera parte de la temporada?
Yo llevo muchos años en el fútbol. Y no me sorprende nada de lo que pueda suceder, ¿no? Son cosas normales, son cosas que han sucedido, son cosas que seguramente van a volver a pasar en un futuro. O sea que hay que afrontarlas con la responsabilidad del cargo, con la responsabilidad de lo que representamos y a partir de ahí trabajar para revertir la situación. Pero no es algo que me sorprenda demasiado.
Hola, ¿qué tal, Xavi? Buenos días, Javier Herrera de la cadena SER. Nos has contado estas últimas ruedas de prensa que tienes una buena comunicación con el presidente, con el club. Quería saber si desde la derrota ante el City has vuelto a hablar con el presidente y con el club y si notas la confianza del club contigo.
Sí, desde el inicio, desde que estoy aquí, hemos tenido una comunicación constante con el presidente, con José Ángel, con otra gente importante del club, porque vamos en esto estamos todos juntos, desde la confianza, del respeto, desde el cariño, desde la responsabilidad del objetivo común. Siempre es buena la comunicación.
¿Qué tal, Xavi? Sergio Rodríguez, del diario Marca. El otro día decía Karim Benzema en una entrevista que en este Madrid falta una figura de peso en el vestuario para a veces decirle a Mbappé, a Vinicius, a Bellingham lo que hace mal. ¿Usted ha echado en falta una figura así para aliviar ciertos momentos de tensión en el vestuario cuando se ha dado? Gracias.
Bueno, en el vestuario estamos todos los días juntos, estamos trabajando en los momentos buenos, en los no tan buenos. Sabemos que ahora por las circunstancias pues estamos pasando dificultades, pero creemos también que podemos crecer. Si pues pasamos estos momentos difíciles, revertimos un poco la dinámica, igual dentro de unas semanas miramos hacia atrás y dijimos, uy, ¿cómo lo pasamos? Pero nos ha fortalecido, ¿no? Y esos son los procesos de todos los equipos, de todos los vestuarios. Seguro que Karim tiene mucha experiencia y ha vivido muchas cosas, ¿no? Y este vestuario también hay gente que tiene ese bagaje y esa personalidad para poder tomar decisiones.
Aquí, perdón, mister Carlos Forjanes del diario AS. Al principio, cuando usted llegó al Mundial de Clubes, un poco en medio en broma anunciaba, ¿no?, el parte médico, que decía cada día, ¿no?,
sí,
quién estaba, quién no estaba. Sí. Han pasado unos meses y yo no sé si no tiene tanta experiencia como entrenador, pero ¿se había encontrado alguna vez una situación en la que prácticamente mirase a la enfermería como ahora pasa y haya tantos futbolistas? Bueno, y sobre todo además en situaciones, porque dijéramos si es a final de temporada se han acumulado los partidos, pero es que todavía no hemos acabado siquiera este año y el número de lesionados se multiplica cada semana.
Bueno, respecto al City no hay ninguna otra baja, o sea que ese es el parte médicos actualizado si quiere. Recuperamos a Kylian, pero tenemos 3 sancionados, o sea que eso es también parte del juego y sí que no contamos con muchos jugadores. Completamos la convocatoria con jugadores del Castilla que siempre que suben dan calidad al entrenamiento, están dispuestos en caso de ser necesitados, y para mañana vamos con los que están bien y con los que nos ayudan para Vitoria.
Mister, aquí Tatiana Mantovani, TNT Sports Brasil. En el último partido salieron todos los jugadores a demostrar públicamente su apoyo a usted. ¿Usted cree que la relación ahora mismo con el vestuario es mucho mejor que algunos días atrás?
Siempre he sentido que hemos tenido buena relación, buena conexión, que hemos peleado, bueno, peleamos siempre por un objetivo común, es que las cosas vayan lo mejor posible. Y el otro día, después cuando acabó el partido, no ganamos, pero el reproche no había ningún reproche a los jugadores, y de cara a mañana necesitamos ese objetivo común por el que estamos aquí, y mañana vamos a Vitoria con eso.
¿Qué tal, Xavi? Miguel Ángel Toribio en directo para Radio Marca. El otro día, al acabar el partido, muchos compañeros de la prensa inglesa y muchos comentaristas, que en su día fueron futbolistas, un poco alucinaban con que su puesto estuviera en entredicho. Yo le quería preguntar si cree que esa cultura de proyecto de la Premier, esa paciencia que se tiene con los técnicos en Inglaterra, si cree que aquí hace falta un poco esa visión.
No, pero yo no entro nunca a valorar las interpretaciones de otra gente. No sé, esas que me dices no las he leído, entonces no puedo entrar a valorarlas. Bueno, pues entonces no las he escuchado, entonces pues, las tendré que escuchar para poder valorarlas, pero no me gusta demasiado entrar a interpretar cosas que otros dicen. Otros tienen su opinión y cada uno es responsable de la suya.
Hacemos las últimas 2 preguntas.
Hola, mister. Aquí Ignacio Miguel de TNT Sports México. A coalición de lo que decía el compañero, yo le quiero preguntar si usted siente que en el fútbol actual no hay paciencia con los entrenadores y con la idea que tienen los entrenadores, y en su caso particular, si cree que no se está siendo paciente con usted. Gracias.
Como he dicho antes, yo llevo bastantes años, no tantos entrenando, pero sí cerca del fútbol. Y en el fútbol español, igual tienes poca memoria, pero había no sé cuántos entrenadores habrán sido cesados, 2 en la liga a estas alturas. Paunovic, Calero, bueno, no sé si alguna más, vosotros tenéis buena memoria también. Pero estoy seguro que tiras de estadística y en el pasado ha habido muchos más ceses a estas alturas. O sea que es muy fácil decir, no, en el pasado es tirar de estadísticas, igual estoy equivocado, pero mi impresión no es esa. Mi impresión es que el fútbol es exigente y que ha habido incluso otras épocas en las que ha habido más ceses a estas alturas.
Última pregunta.
Hola, Xavi, aquí Adrián Fuz para el desmarque. Yo quería...
Ahí dejo el trabajo para algunos de vosotros para estos días. Yo tengo bastante trabajo, o sea que no me voy a poner trabajo extra.
¿Qué tal? Aquí Adrián Fuz para el desmarque. Yo quería preguntarte por Álvaro Arbeloa, entrenador del Castilla, buen amigo tuyo. Es uno de los nombres que se habla estos días como un futurible entrenador del Real Madrid. Yo no sé si tú, con esa buena relación que tenéis, comentáis este tipo de cosas y qué valoración haces al respecto. Gracias.
¿Valoración respecto a qué?
A que Arbeloa...
¿A la relación que tengo con Álvaro?
No, a la que pueda ser entrenador del Real Madrid él.
Yo creo que Álvaro en un futuro podrá ser entrenador del Real Madrid. Yo creo que está haciendo las cosas muy bien, pero lo que tú me has preguntado, no hemos hablado más de los jugadores que vienen con nosotros mañana, de eso no hemos hablado absolutamente nada.
Muchas gracias.
Hey guys, tonight we begin with a figure who haunts the edges of medieval history. Not a knight, not a king, but the man who stood on the scaffold with an axe in his hands and blood on his conscience. The executioner. While Hollywood paints him as a hooded villain or a silent professional, the truth is far grimmer. Being a medieval executioner wasn't just a job, it was a curse that followed you from birth to grave, marking you as untouchable, unclean, and utterly alone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, adjust your pillow, and let the world slow down around you. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, certain professions carried a stain that no amount of prayer or penance could wash away. Tanners who worked with animal hides, grave diggers who handled the dead, and prostitutes who sold their bodies, all were considered dishonorable. But none bore the weight of social death quite like the executioner. He was necessary, yes. Every functioning society needed someone to carry out the sentences handed down by judges and lords. Yet the moment a man took up the axe or the rope, he ceased to be fully human in the eyes of his neighbors. This wasn't superstition. It was codified law. In many German-speaking territories, executioners were legally classified as unehrlich, without honor. They could not join guilds, could not testify in court, could not be buried in consecrated ground. Their children inherited this dishonor like a genetic disease. A baker's son became a baker. A blacksmith's son learned the forge. But an executioner's son had only one path: to follow his father onto the scaffold, because no other trade would have him. The origins of this stigma ran deep, tangled in medieval theology and ancient taboos. The Church taught that all life was sacred, a gift from God. To take a life, even in the name of justice, was to stain one's soul. The executioner became a necessary sinner, a man who committed murder so that others wouldn't have to. He absorbed the community's guilt, becoming a kind of scapegoat. After each execution, he carried away not just the body, but the collective shame of the act itself. In some regions, the executioner was required to live outside the town walls, in a house set apart from decent society. He entered the city only when summoned for work, and when he walked the streets, people crossed to the other side. Children were warned not to look at him. Women clutched their rosaries. Even dogs, it was said, would not approach him. He moved through the world like a ghost, visible but untouchable, present but profoundly alone. And yet, paradoxically, the executioner held a strange kind of power. He was feared, and fear can sometimes masquerade as respect. Lords and magistrates depended on him to maintain order, to make examples of criminals, to demonstrate that justice, however brutal, still functioned. Without him, the entire legal system would collapse into chaos. So he was both despised and indispensable, a walking contradiction that medieval society could neither embrace nor eliminate. This duality shaped every aspect of his existence. He was paid well, often better than a skilled craftsman, because few men would willingly take the job. He received fees for executions, floggings, brandings, and tortures. He also claimed the clothes and possessions of the condemned, which he could sell. In some cities, he held a monopoly on certain trades, rendering animal fat, collecting night soil, disposing of dead animals. These were tasks no one else wanted, and they added to his income while deepening his isolation. But money could not buy him dignity. A wealthy executioner was still an executioner. He could own a fine house, dress in good cloth, eat meat every day, and still be barred from the tavern, the church pew, the marriage bed of any honorable family. His wealth was tainted, earned through blood and suffering. To accept his coin was to accept contamination. Merchants would take his money, yes, but they would not shake his hand. They would not invite him to their tables. They would not let their daughters speak his name. The executioner's family lived in this shadow. His wife, if he could find one, was usually the daughter of another executioner, or a woman so desperate, widowed, orphaned, disgraced, that she had no other choice. Their children grew up knowing they were different, marked. They played alone. They learned early not to expect friendship, not to hope for acceptance. The boys would inherit their father's profession. The girls might marry into another executioner's family, perpetuating the cycle. It was a closed world, a hereditary caste from which there was almost no escape. Some executioners tried to break free. They saved their money, moved to distant cities where they weren't known, attempted to start new lives under false names. But the medieval world was small, and secrets traveled. A man's past had a way of catching up with him. A former neighbor might recognize him. A rival might expose him. And once the truth came out, the stain reappeared, as indelible as ever. The executioner could run, but he could not hide from what he was. This was the foundation of the executioner's nightmare. Not the violence of his work, though that was terrible enough, but the absolute certainty that he would never be anything other than what he was. No redemption, no second chances, no hope of rejoining the human community. He was locked into his role as surely as a prisoner in a cell, and the key had been thrown away before he was even born. The scaffold was the executioner's stage, and every performance was public. Medieval justice was not a private affair conducted behind closed doors. It was spectacle, theater, a communal ritual designed to reinforce social order and divine law. Executions drew crowds, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, depending on the crime and the criminal. They came from the city and the surrounding countryside, bringing their children, their bread, their ale. They came to witness justice, to see sin punished, to remind themselves that the world still made sense. For the executioner, this meant working under the gaze of an audience that despised him, even as it depended on him. He climbed the scaffold steps knowing that every eye was upon him, judging not just his skill, but his very existence. A clean, swift execution might earn grudging approval, not for him as a person, but for his competence. A botched job, however, could turn the crowd into a mob. If the axe missed its mark, if the condemned suffered unnecessarily, the spectators might riot. They might attack the executioner, beat him, even kill him. He was there to deliver death efficiently, and any failure was unforgivable. The pressure was immense. Imagine standing before 1,000 hostile faces, holding an axe that weighs as much as a small child, knowing that you have one chance, one swing, to sever a human head from its body. The condemned kneels before you, trembling or praying or cursing. The crowd is silent, waiting. Your hands are sweating. Your heart is pounding. You raise the axe, and in that moment, everything depends on your precision, your strength, your nerve. Beheading was considered a merciful death, reserved for nobles and those of higher status. It was supposed to be quick, painless, a single stroke that ended consciousness before the body even registered the blow. But in practice, it was far more difficult than it sounds. The human neck is not a clean target. Bone, muscle, sinew, all must be severed in one motion. The condemned might flinch at the last second, throwing off the executioner's aim. The axe might be dull, or the executioner's grip might slip. And if the first blow failed to kill, the horror multiplied. There are records of executions that required 2, 3, even 5 blows before the head finally came free. Each failed attempt was a fresh agony for the condemned and a fresh humiliation for the executioner. The crowd would jeer, shout, throw things. The executioner would have to raise the axe again, his hands now slick with blood, his mind reeling with panic and shame. And all the while the condemned was still alive, still suffering, still screaming. Hanging was more common, especially for lower-class criminals. It was cheaper, required less skill, and could be done in batches. But it was not the clean, quick death that modern imagination suggests. The drop method, which breaks the neck instantly, was not widely used in the medieval period. Instead, the condemned was usually hoisted up by a rope around the neck and left to strangle slowly. Death could take minutes, sometimes longer. The body would convulse, the face would turn purple, the tongue would protrude. It was an ugly, undignified end, and the executioner had to stand by and watch, ensuring that the sentence was carried out fully. Sometimes the condemned would struggle, clawing at the rope, kicking wildly. Sometimes family members would rush forward and pull on the legs, trying to hasten death and end the suffering. The executioner was expected to maintain order, to keep the crowd back, to make sure no one interfered. He was both performer and enforcer, responsible for the smooth running of a ritual that was inherently chaotic and brutal. And then there were the more elaborate punishments, the ones designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. Breaking on the wheel, for instance, was reserved for the worst criminals, murderers, traitors, those who had committed crimes so heinous that ordinary death was deemed insufficient. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use an iron bar to systematically break every major bone in the body: arms, legs, ribs, spine. The process was slow, deliberate, agonizing. The condemned might live for hours, even days, before finally succumbing to shock and internal injuries. The executioner had to be strong, precise, and utterly detached. He had to strike hard enough to shatter bone, but not so hard that he killed too quickly. He had to pace himself, moving methodically from limb to limb, while the condemned screamed and the crowd watched in fascinated horror. This was not a job for the squeamish or the empathetic. It required a kind of emotional shutdown, a willingness to treat the human body as an object, a thing to be broken according to a prescribed formula. Burning at the stake was another public spectacle, used primarily for heretics and witches. The executioner's role here was to build the pyre, bind the condemned, and light the fire. If he was merciful, or if he had been bribed, he might strangle the condemned first, or place a bag of gunpowder around their neck to hasten death. But often, mercy was not part of the sentence. The condemned was meant to burn alive, to suffer visibly, to serve as a warning to others. The executioner would stand by, feeding the flames, ensuring that the fire burned hot and steady, while the smell of burning flesh filled the air and the screams echoed across the square. Each method of execution carried its own technical challenges and psychological burdens. The executioner had to master them all, had to be equally proficient with axe, rope, wheel, and fire. He was a specialist in death, a craftsman of suffering, and his workshop was the scaffold. And every time he climbed those steps, he carried with him the knowledge that he was not just ending a life, he was performing a role that would define him forever, that would mark him as something less than human in the eyes of everyone who watched. The executioner's tools were extensions of his cursed profession, and they too carried a stigma. The axe, the rope, the branding iron. These were not ordinary objects. They were instruments of death and pain, and they were believed to absorb something of the suffering they inflicted. In some regions it was considered unlucky even to touch an executioner's tools. They were kept in a special shed or locked room, away from the rest of the community, as if their very presence might contaminate the innocent. The axe was the executioner's primary tool for beheadings, and it had to be maintained with obsessive care. A dull blade meant a botched execution, and a botched execution meant public humiliation, possible violence, and the loss of reputation. So the executioner spent hours sharpening, oiling, balancing his axe. He knew its weight, its heft, the exact angle at which it cut most cleanly. It was his partner in the grim work, and he treated it with a respect that bordered on reverence. But the axe was also a burden. It was heavy, not just in physical terms, but in symbolic weight. Every time he picked it up, he was reminded of what he was, what he did. The axe was a mirror that reflected his identity back at him, unadorned and undeniable. He was the man who killed. That was his function, his purpose, his curse. And the axe was the proof. The rope, used for hangings, was simpler, but no less significant. It had to be strong, thick, and properly knotted. A rope that broke mid-execution was a disaster, both for the condemned and for the executioner. The crowd would see it as a sign, perhaps divine intervention, perhaps incompetence. Either way, it undermined the authority of the law and the executioner's own standing. So he checked and rechecked his ropes, tested them, replaced them regularly. He could not afford mistakes. Branding irons, used to mark criminals with symbols of their crimes, required a different kind of precision. The iron had to be heated to exactly the right temperature, hot enough to sear flesh, but not so hot that it caused excessive damage or killed through shock. The executioner had to press it firmly against the skin, holding it steady while the condemned screamed and struggled. The smell of burning flesh was immediate and nauseating, and it clung to the executioner's clothes, his hair, his skin. He carried that smell with him, a constant reminder of his work. Torture devices were even more specialized. The rack, the thumbscrews, the strappato. These were tools designed not to kill, but to extract confessions, to break the will without breaking the body too quickly. The executioner, in many regions, was also the official torturer, responsible for applying these devices under the supervision of judges and magistrates. He had to know how much pain a human body could endure, how to push someone to the edge of death without crossing it. This required a kind of knowledge that was both technical and deeply disturbing, an intimate familiarity with suffering. Torture was not random or sadistic, at least not officially. It was regulated, codified, part of the legal process. There were rules about how long a session could last, what methods could be used, how many times a person could be tortured. The executioner was expected to follow these rules, to be a professional administrator of pain. But the rules did not make the work any less horrific. He still had to listen to the screams, still had to watch as bodies twisted and broke, still had to live with the knowledge that he was the instrument of this suffering. And after each session, he had to clean his tools, put them away, prepare for the next time. The blood had to be scrubbed off, the mechanisms oiled, the ropes coiled. It was maintenance work, mundane and methodical, but it was also a ritual of its own, a way of processing what he had just done, of compartmentalizing the horror so that he could function the next day. The executioner's tools were not just objects. They were symbols of his separation from humanity, markers of his role as the community's designated killer. And they were also, in a strange way, his only companions. He spent more time with his axe and his rope than he did with other people. He knew them intimately, trusted them, relied on them. They were the only things in his life that did not judge him, that did not recoil from his touch. In a world that rejected him at every turn, his tools were the only constants, the only things that made sense. The executioner's home was a place of exile within the city itself. In many medieval towns, he was required to live in a house set apart, often near the gallows or the city dump, in a location that marked him as separate from respectable society. This was not just a matter of convenience. It was a deliberate act of social quarantine, a way of containing the contamination that he represented. His house might be larger than those of ordinary laborers, paid for with the fees he earned from executions and other grim tasks, but size did not equal comfort. The house was a prison of a different kind, a place where he could retreat from the hostile stares of the world, but never truly escape his identity. The walls might be thick, the roof sound, but they could not keep out the knowledge of what he was, what he did. Inside, the house was functional, sparse. There was little point in decoration or luxury. Who would visit? Who would admire his furnishings or compliment his taste? The executioner lived alone or with his immediate family, and even within that small circle, there was a heaviness, a silence that spoke of shared shame and inherited curse. Conversations were brief, practical. There was little laughter, little joy. The house was a place of survival, not of living. The kitchen was where his wife, if he had one, prepared meals from the food he brought home, often the leftover possessions of the condemned sold at market, or the meat from animals he had been paid to slaughter. The executioner often held a monopoly on certain undesirable trades: knacker, skinner, renderer of animal fat. These were jobs that involved death and decay, and they added to his income while reinforcing his status as a man who dealt in the unclean. The smell of his work followed him home. Blood, sweat, the acrid tang of fear. These were scents that no amount of washing could fully remove. His wife grew accustomed to it, or at least learned to endure it. His children, if he had any, grew up with that smell as part of their world, as normal to them as the scent of bread baking was to other families. But it was not normal. It was a constant olfactory reminder of their father's profession, of the life they were born into and could not escape. At night, the executioner lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling. Sleep did not come easily. The faces of the condemned haunted him, not as ghosts perhaps, but as memories that refused to fade. He remembered their eyes, wide with terror or resignation. He remembered their last words, their pleas for mercy, their curses. He remembered the weight of the axe in his hands, the resistance of flesh and bone, the sound, always the sound, of the blade striking home. Some executioners turned to drink to dull the memories, to quiet the voices in their heads. Ale, wine, whatever they could afford or steal. They drank until they passed out, until the world blurred and the faces faded, at least for a few hours. But the relief was temporary, and the mornings were brutal. Hangovers compounded by guilt, by the knowledge that they would have to do it all again, that there was no escape, no end. Others turned inward, becoming silent and withdrawn. They spoke little, even to their families. They moved through their days like automatons, performing their tasks with mechanical efficiency but no emotion. This was a survival strategy, a way of protecting what remained of their humanity by shutting down the parts of themselves that felt, that cared, that remembered. But it came at a cost. The executioner became a hollow man, a shell, present in body but absent in spirit. And then there were the nights when sleep did come, but brought with it nightmares, dreams of executions gone wrong, of axes that missed, of ropes that broke, of crowds that turned into mobs, dreams of the condemned rising from the dead, their severed heads reattaching, their broken bodies reassembling, coming for him with accusing eyes and grasping hands. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and lie there in the darkness, waiting for dawn, knowing that the nightmares were just another part of the job, another burden he had to carry. His home was supposed to be a refuge, a place of safety and rest. But for the executioner, there was no refuge. The scaffold followed him home, lived in his walls, slept in his bed. He could close the door, but he could not shut out what he was. The house was just another cell, and he was both prisoner and guard, locked in a life sentence from which there was no parole. The executioner's relationship with the church was fraught with contradiction and pain. The church taught that all life was sacred, that murder was a mortal sin, that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was absolute. And yet, the church also supported the legal system, blessed the judges, and sanctioned the executions. The executioner was caught in the middle of this theological paradox, a man who committed acts that the church condemned but also required. In many regions, the executioner was barred from receiving communion. He could attend Mass, standing at the back of the church, but he could not approach the altar, could not partake of the body and blood of Christ. This was a devastating exclusion. In the medieval world, communion was not just a ritual, it was a lifeline, a connection to God and the community of believers. To be denied it was to be cast out, to be marked as spiritually unclean. Some priests refused to hear the executioner's confession. They argued that his sins were too great, too ongoing, that he could not truly repent while continuing to kill. Others would hear his confession but would impose penances that were impossible to fulfill, pilgrimages to distant shrines, donations he could not afford, prayers that would take years to complete. The message was clear. The executioner's soul was in jeopardy, and there was little he could do to save it. This spiritual isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the executioner's life. He was not just rejected by society, he was rejected by God, or at least by God's representatives on earth. He could pray, but his prayers felt hollow, unanswered. He could seek forgiveness, but forgiveness was withheld. He was trapped in a state of perpetual sin, a man who could not stop doing the thing that damned him because it was the only thing he was allowed to do. Some executioners became deeply religious, paradoxically. They attended Mass faithfully, said their rosaries, made offerings to the saints. They hoped that somehow, through sheer devotion, they might earn a place in heaven despite their profession. They clung to the belief that God, in his infinite mercy, would understand, would see that they were just doing their duty, that they had no choice. But this hope was fragile, constantly undermined by the Church's own teachings and the hostility of the clergy. Others lost their faith entirely. They concluded that if God existed, he had abandoned them, or worse, that he had created them specifically to suffer, to be the instruments of his justice and the recipients of his wrath. These executioners became bitter, cynical, going through the motions of their work with no belief in any higher purpose or ultimate redemption. They were nihilists before the word existed, men who saw the world as a cruel joke and themselves as the punchline. The Church's attitude toward the executioner reflected a broader medieval anxiety about violence and justice. Society needed order, and order required punishment, and punishment sometimes required death. But who would do the killing? Who would take on the spiritual burden of ending a life? The executioner was the answer, the scapegoat who absorbed the community's guilt so that everyone else could remain pure. He was the necessary sinner, the man who damned himself so that others could be saved. This role was reinforced through ritual and symbolism. In some regions, the executioner was required to wear distinctive clothing, a red cloak, a hood, a badge that marked him as different, as other. He was not allowed to touch people in the street. If he did, they would recoil as if burned. He was not allowed to draw water from the public well. His touch would contaminate it. He was not allowed to enter certain buildings, attend certain festivals, participate in certain rituals. He was a living ghost, visible but intangible, present but excluded. And yet, the Church also depended on him. When a heretic was burned at the stake, it was the executioner who built the pyre and lit the fire. When a criminal was tortured to extract a confession, it was the executioner who turned the screws and pulled the ropes. The Church's hands remained clean, but only because the executioner's hands were stained. He was the instrument of divine justice, but he was also the repository of divine wrath, the man who bore the weight of God's anger so that the priests could speak of God's love. This theological tightrope was impossible to walk. The executioner could not be both holy and damned, both necessary and despised, both servant of God and enemy of the Church. But that was exactly what he was expected to be, and so he lived in a state of spiritual limbo, neither saved nor entirely lost, waiting for a judgment that might never come, hoping for a mercy that seemed perpetually out of reach. The executioner's children inherited not just a profession, but a destiny. From the moment they were born, their futures were determined. The boys would become executioners. The girls would marry executioners. There was no other path, no other possibility. This was not a choice. It was a sentence passed down from generation to generation like a genetic curse. Growing up as the child of an executioner meant growing up in isolation. Other children were forbidden to play with them. Parents warned their sons and daughters to stay away, to avoid contamination. The executioner's children learned early that they were different, that they carried a mark that set them apart from everyone else. They learned to expect rejection, to accept loneliness, to build walls around their hearts because no one else would let them in. School, if they attended at all, was a torment. They sat alone, spoke to no one, were mocked and bullied by their peers. Teachers treated them with cold indifference or open hostility. They were not expected to succeed, not encouraged to dream. Their futures were already written, and education was largely irrelevant. What did an executioner's son need to know beyond how to swing an axe and tie a noose? The girls had it no better. They were considered unmarriageable outside their own caste. No respectable family would allow their son to wed an executioner's daughter, no matter how beautiful or virtuous she might be. Her father's profession tainted her, made her unclean, unworthy. So she waited, hoping that another executioner's family might have a son of marriageable age, that she might at least have a husband and children of her own, even if they too would be cursed. The training of an executioner's son began early, often in childhood. He would accompany his father to the scaffold, watch the executions, learn the techniques. At first he might be given small tasks, sharpening the axe, preparing the rope, cleaning up afterward. But gradually he would take on more responsibility until the day came when he performed his first execution, with his father watching, guiding, correcting. That first execution was a rite of passage, a moment when the boy became a man, or rather, when he became an executioner, which was something different, something less. He would remember it for the rest of his life, the weight of the axe, the trembling of his hands, the face of the condemned, the sound of the crowd, and he would know, in that moment, that there was no going back, that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Some sons rebelled. They refused to follow in their father's footsteps, tried to run away, to find work elsewhere, to escape the curse. But the medieval world was small and interconnected. Word traveled. A young man who fled his executioner father would be recognized, exposed, sent back. And even if he managed to hide his identity for a time, the truth would eventually come out. A slip of the tongue, a chance encounter, a vengeful informant, and his new life would collapse, revealing the old one beneath. Others accepted their fate with resignation. They saw no point in fighting, no hope of escape. They learned the trade, performed their duties, and tried not to think too much about what they were doing or what it meant. They became efficient, competent, emotionally numb. They were their father's sons, and they would raise their own sons to be the same, perpetuating the cycle into the next generation and the next. The daughters, meanwhile, lived in a different kind of prison. They were trapped in their father's house, waiting for a marriage that might never come, knowing that even if it did, it would only be to another executioner's family, another cursed household. They had no prospects, no future beyond the narrow confines of their caste. Some became bitter, resentful, angry at a world that had condemned them for something they had not done, for a crime they had not committed. Others became resigned, accepting their lot with a quiet despair that was perhaps even more tragic. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation. The executioner's family was a closed system, a hereditary caste that reproduced itself endlessly, each new generation inheriting the sins and the stigma of the one before. There was no escape, no redemption, no hope of breaking free. The children of executioners were born into a nightmare, and they would die in it, and their children would do the same. The executioner's relationship with the condemned was complex and deeply troubling. On one level, they were enemies, the killer and the victim, the instrument of justice and the object of punishment. But on another level, they were intimately connected, bound together in a ritual that neither had chosen but both had to perform. In the days or hours before an execution, the executioner often spent time with the condemned. This was partly practical. He needed to assess their physical condition, determine the best method of execution, ensure that everything would go smoothly. But it was also psychological. The executioner was, in a strange way, the condemned's only companion in those final moments, the only person who would be with them until the very end. Some executioners were kind, offering words of comfort, a drink of water, a prayer. They saw the condemned as fellow human beings, victims of circumstance or bad choices, deserving of at least a measure of compassion. These executioners tried to make the process as painless as possible, to grant a quick death, to minimize suffering. They were professionals, yes, but they were also men with consciences, and they struggled to reconcile their duty with their humanity. Others were cold, detached, treating the condemned as objects rather than people. This was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting themselves from the emotional toll of their work. If they allowed themselves to see the condemned as human, to empathize with their fear and pain, they would be overwhelmed by guilt and horror. So they shut down, became machines, performed their tasks with mechanical efficiency and no feeling. And then there were the executioners who were cruel, who took pleasure in their work, who enjoyed the power they held over the condemned. These were rare, but they existed. Men who had been so brutalized by their profession, so dehumanized by society, that they had lost all capacity for empathy. They became sadists, inflicting unnecessary pain, prolonging suffering, reveling in the fear and agony of their victims. They were monsters, but they were monsters created by the system, shaped by the very role they had been forced to play. The condemned, for their part, had varied reactions to the executioner. Some begged for mercy, pleaded for their lives, offered bribes or promises. Others cursed him, spat at him, vowed that his soul would be damned for what he was about to do. Still others were resigned, accepting their fate with a calm that was almost eerie, as if they had already left their bodies and were watching from a distance. There were moments of strange intimacy. The executioner might hold the condemned's hand, whisper a prayer, offer a final blessing. He might adjust the rope or the blindfold, ensuring that everything was as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. In those moments, the boundary between killer and victim blurred, and they became simply two human beings caught in a tragedy neither had authored. But the intimacy was always temporary, always shattered by the act itself. The axe fell, the rope tightened, the fire was lit, and the condemned was gone, and the executioner was left alone, standing on the scaffold, surrounded by the crowd, holding the tools of death, knowing that he would have to do it all again, that there would be another condemned, another execution, another moment of terrible intimacy, followed by irreversible violence. Some executioners kept records of the people they killed, names, crimes, dates. This was partly for legal purposes, but it was also a way of remembering, of bearing witness. Each name was a life ended, a story cut short, a person who had once been as real and complex as the executioner himself. The list grew longer over the years, a grim tally of death that the executioner carried with him, a burden that grew heavier with each edition. Others tried to forget, to erase the faces and names from their memory, to pretend that the condemned were not individuals but abstractions, symbols of crime and punishment. But forgetting was impossible. The faces came back in dreams, in idle moments, in the quiet hours of the night. They haunted the executioner, not as ghosts, but as memories, as reminders of what he had done and what he would continue to do until he died or was replaced. The relationship between executioner and condemned was a microcosm of the executioner's entire existence, a relationship defined by necessity, by violence, by a connection that was both intimate and unbridgeable. They were bound together in a ritual of death, and neither could escape it. The condemned died, but the executioner lived on, carrying the weight of that death and all the deaths that came before, and all the deaths that would come after. The executioner's body bore the marks of his profession. The physical toll of the work was immense, often overlooked in favor of the psychological and social burdens, but no less real. Swinging an axe, pulling a rope, turning the wheel, these were acts of intense physical exertion, repeated over and over year after year, until the body began to break down. The executioner's hands were calloused, scarred, permanently stained. No amount of scrubbing could remove the discoloration, the faint traces of blood that seemed to have seeped into the skin itself. His grip was strong, developed through years of wielding heavy tools, but it was also painful. Arthritis set in early, a consequence of the repetitive strain, the constant gripping and swinging. His fingers would stiffen, ache, refuse to bend properly. Simple tasks, buttoning a shirt, holding a cup, became difficult, reminders of the work that had destroyed his hands. His back was another casualty. The axe was heavy, and the motion of swinging it, raising it high, bringing it down with force, put enormous strain on the spine. Over time, the executioner developed chronic pain, a dull ache that never fully went away, that flared into sharp agony with certain movements. He walked with a stoop, his posture permanently altered by the weight he had carried, both literal and metaphorical. His shoulders were broad, muscular, but also damaged. The repetitive motion of the swing created imbalances, overdeveloped some muscles while weakening others. He suffered from strains, tears, inflammation. There were no physical therapists, no pain relievers beyond alcohol and herbal remedies of dubious effectiveness. He simply endured, working through the pain because he had no choice, because the work had to be done. His knees and legs bore the burden of standing for long hours on the scaffold, of climbing the steps again and again, of maintaining balance while performing executions. The scaffold was often unsteady, the wood old and warped, and the executioner had to adjust his stance constantly, compensating for the movement. This took a toll on his joints, leading to chronic pain, swelling, difficulty walking. By middle age, many executioners limped, their gait uneven, their mobility compromised. And then there were the injuries, the accidents that were an inevitable part of the job. A slip of the axe could result in a deep cut, a severed finger, a gash that bled profusely and healed slowly, if it healed at all. Infection was a constant risk. The executioner worked with blood, with open wounds, with bodies that were often diseased. He had no gloves, no protective gear, no understanding of germ theory. He simply did his work and hoped that he wouldn't fall ill, that the fever wouldn't come, that the wound wouldn't fester and turn gangrenous. Some executioners lost fingers, hands, even limbs to infection or accident. They continued to work, adapting as best they could, because there was no disability pension, no retirement plan, no safety net. They worked until they physically could not, and then they were replaced, often by their own sons, and left to live out their remaining days in pain and poverty. The executioner's face also bore the marks of his profession. The constant exposure to the elements, standing on the scaffold in all weather, sun, rain, snow, wind, aged him prematurely. His skin was weathered, lined, leathery. His eyes were hard, distant, the eyes of a man who had seen too much, who had witnessed suffering beyond what most people could imagine. There was no softness in his gaze, no warmth. He looked at the world with a kind of weary resignation, as if he had long ago given up hope of finding anything good or beautiful in it. And his expression was often blank, neutral, a mask that he wore to hide whatever he was feeling inside. He had learned not to show emotion, not to let the crowd see his fear or his doubt or his guilt. He performed his role with a stoic detachment that was both a survival strategy and a prison. He could not afford to be human, to be vulnerable, to let anyone see the man beneath the executioner. So he hid, behind the mask, behind the role, behind the physical shell that was slowly breaking down under the weight of his work. The executioner's body was a tool, used and abused, worn down by the demands of his profession. And like all tools, it eventually broke, leaving him a shadow of what he had once been, a man whose body had been sacrificed to the machinery of justice, whose physical suffering was just one more layer of the nightmare he lived every day. The executioner's relationship with money was paradoxical. He was often well paid, earning more than many skilled craftsmen, yet his wealth brought him no comfort, no security, no respect. The money he earned was tainted, blood money, and it carried the same stigma as the man who earned it. Executioners received fees for each execution, with the amount varying depending on the method and the status of the condemned. A beheading, considered a more honorable death, paid more than a hanging. Torturing a prisoner before execution brought additional fees. The executioner also claimed the clothes and possessions of the condemned, which he could sell. In some cities, he held monopolies on certain trades, rendering animal fat, collecting night soil, disposing of dead animals, all tasks that no one else wanted but that generated steady income. On paper, The executioner could be relatively wealthy. He might own a house, have savings, afford meat and wine, but his wealth was hollow. He could not use it to buy respect, to gain entry into guilds, to secure a better future for his children. His money was accepted by merchants, yes, but with reluctance, with a sense of contamination. The coins he handed over were seen as cursed, tainted by the blood and suffering from which they came. Some executioners tried to use their wealth to improve their social standing. They donated to the church, hoping to buy indulgences, to secure prayers for their souls. They gave to the poor, hoping to earn goodwill, to be seen as charitable rather than monstrous. But these efforts rarely succeeded. The church took their money but still barred them from communion. The poor accepted their charity but still crossed the street to avoid them. The executioner's wealth could not erase his identity, could not wash away the stain of his profession. Others hoarded their money, saving obsessively, driven by a deep insecurity. They knew that their position was precarious, that they could be dismissed at any time, that they had no safety net beyond what they could accumulate. They lived frugally, denying themselves comforts, squirreling away every coin, preparing for a future that might never come. And when they died, their savings often went to their children, who used it to perpetuate the same cursed existence, to buy the tools and the house and the life of the next generation of executioners. And then there were the executioners who spent recklessly, who drank away their earnings, who gambled, who sought oblivion in excess. They saw no point in saving, no hope for the future, no reason to deny themselves the fleeting pleasures that money could buy. They lived for the moment, for the temporary escape that alcohol or women or games of chance could provide. And when the money ran out, they simply waited for the next execution, the next fee, the next opportunity to earn and spend and forget. The executioner's wealth was also a source of resentment. Other laborers, struggling to feed their families, looked at the executioner's relative prosperity with envy and anger. Why should the man who killed earn more than the man who built or farmed or crafted? It seemed unjust, a perversion of the natural order. But the resentment was muted by fear. No one wanted to challenge the executioner directly, to risk his wrath or his curse. So they muttered among themselves, nursed their grievances, and kept their distance. In some regions, the executioner was required to pay special taxes or fees, a way of extracting some of his earnings back into the community. These were often arbitrary, punitive, designed to remind him that his wealth was conditional, that he existed at the sufferance of the authorities. He could be fined for minor infractions, charged for the use of public facilities, taxed at higher rates than other citizens. His money was his, but only barely, always subject to confiscation or penalty. The executioner's relationship with money was thus another layer of his nightmare. He earned well, but his earnings brought him no joy, no security, no escape. The money was a reminder of what he did, of the lives he took, of the suffering he inflicted. It was blood money, and it stained his hands as surely as the blood itself. He could count his coins, but he could not count on them to save him, to redeem him, to make his life anything other than what it was, a living nightmare from which there was no waking. The executioner's interactions with the legal system were fraught with tension and ambiguity. He was an essential part of the machinery of justice, yet he was also its most despised component. Judges, magistrates, and officials depended on him to carry out their sentences, but they treated him with a mixture of contempt and unease, as if his very presence reminded them of the violence that underpinned their authority. In court, the executioner was often present during trials, especially those involving torture. His role was to administer the torture under the supervision of the judges, to extract confessions through pain. This was a legally sanctioned process, governed by strict rules and procedures. The executioner was not supposed to act on his own initiative. He was an instrument, a tool wielded by the court. But the distinction was often blurred. The judges could distance themselves from the violence, could claim that they were merely overseeing, that the executioner was the one who actually inflicted the pain. And the executioner, for his part, could claim that he was merely following orders, that he had no choice, that the responsibility lay with the judges. This mutual evasion of responsibility created a moral vacuum. No one was truly accountable for the suffering inflicted in the name of justice. The judges could wash their hands, the executioner could claim innocence, and the victim was left to bear the consequences. It was a system designed to diffuse guilt, to ensure that no single person had to carry the full weight of what was being done. But the guilt did not disappear. It simply spread, contaminating everyone involved, creating a collective stain that no one could escape. The executioner's testimony was not admissible in court. He was considered an unreliable witness, his word tainted by his profession. This meant that he could not defend himself if accused, could not seek legal redress for wrongs done to him. He existed outside the protection of the law even as he served it. If someone attacked him, stole from him, slandered him, he had little recourse. The courts would not take his side, would not punish his attackers. He was on his own, vulnerable, unprotected. This legal marginalization reinforced his social isolation. He was not a citizen in the full sense of the word. He had duties but few rights. He was expected to serve the community, to carry out the sentences handed down by the courts, but he was not considered part of the community. He was a tool, a necessary evil, a man who existed in a legal and social limbo, neither fully inside nor fully outside the system. Some executioners tried to navigate this limbo by cultivating relationships with powerful patrons, judges, nobles, officials who could offer protection or favor. They performed their duties with extra diligence, hoping to earn goodwill, to secure their position, to gain some measure of security. But these relationships were always precarious, always conditional. A patron could withdraw his support at any time, leaving the executioner exposed, vulnerable, alone. Others became cynical, seeing the legal system as a sham, a facade that concealed the brutal reality of power and violence. They performed their duties mechanically, without belief, without hope, simply going through the motions because they had no other choice. They saw the judges as hypocrites, the laws as arbitrary, the entire system as a cruel joke. And they were not entirely wrong. The legal system depended on violence, on the threat of pain and death, to maintain order. And the executioner was the embodiment of that violence, the man who made the threat real. The executioner's role in the legal system was thus a microcosm of his entire existence, necessary but despised, essential but excluded, powerful but powerless. He was the man who made justice possible, but he was also the man who bore the cost of that justice, who carried the guilt and the shame so that others could remain pure. He was the scapegoat, the sacrifice, the necessary sinner who kept the system running even as it destroyed him. The executioner's dreams were a landscape of horror. Sleep, which should have been a refuge, became another battleground, a place where the memories he tried to suppress during the day came flooding back with vivid, inescapable intensity. He dreamed of the scaffold, of the faces of the condemned, of the moment when the axe fell or the rope tightened. He dreamed of executions gone wrong, of bodies that would not die, of crowds that turned into mobs. He dreamed of his own death, of standing on the scaffold as the condemned, of feeling the rope around his own neck, the blade descending toward his own neck. These were not ordinary nightmares. They were relentless, recurring, a nightly torment that left him exhausted, drained, unable to rest. He would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, the images still vivid in his mind. He would lie there in the darkness, trying to calm himself, trying to convince himself that it was just a dream, that it wasn't real. But the line between dream and memory was blurred. The nightmares were built from real experiences, from things he had actually done, and that made them all the more terrifying. Some executioners developed insomnia, afraid to sleep because they knew what awaited them in their dreams. They would stay awake as long as possible, pacing, drinking, doing anything to avoid closing their eyes. But eventually, exhaustion would overtake them, and they would fall into a fitful, troubled sleep, and the nightmares would come anyway. There was no escape, no way to avoid the reckoning that happened every night in the theater of the mind. The content of the nightmares varied, but certain themes recurred. The condemned would speak, would plead, would accuse. They would ask why, would demand justice, would curse the executioner and his family. They would not die cleanly. The executions would go on and on, the condemned suffering endlessly, and the executioner unable to stop, unable to end it. He would swing the axe again and again, but the head would not come off. He would pull the rope, but the condemned would not die. He was trapped in a loop of violence and failure, a hell of his own making. In some nightmares, the roles were reversed. The executioner became the condemned, standing on the scaffold, looking out at the crowd, feeling the terror and helplessness that he had seen in so many faces. He would try to speak, to explain, to beg for mercy, but no words would come. He would see the executioner approaching, axe in hand, and he would recognize himself, his own face, his own hands, his own cold, detached expression. And he would understand in that moment that he was both killer and victim, that he had been executing himself all along. Other nightmares were more abstract, more symbolic. He would dream of drowning in blood, of being buried alive under a mountain of corpses, of walking through a city where everyone he passed was dead, their eyes open and accusing. He would dream of his hands, which would not come clean no matter how much he scrubbed, the blood seeping back through the skin, staining him from the inside out. He would dream of his children, who would look at him with fear and disgust, who would turn away, who would refuse to acknowledge him. The nightmares were not just psychological torture, they had physical effects. The executioner would wake with headaches, with nausea, with a sense of dread that lingered throughout the day. He would be irritable, distracted, unable to focus. The lack of sleep compounded the stress of his work, creating a vicious cycle. The more he worked, the worse the nightmares became. The worse the nightmares, the less he slept. The less he slept, the harder it was to perform his duties. And the harder it was to perform his duties, the more he feared failure, which fed back into the nightmares. Some executioners sought help, turning to priests or healers, hoping for some remedy, some way to quiet the dreams. But there was little that could be done. The priests might offer prayers, might suggest penance, might speak of the need for faith and trust in God. But prayers did not stop the nightmares. The healers might offer potions, herbal remedies, concoctions that promised sleep or peace. But these were often ineffective, or worse, addictive, leading the executioner down a different path of suffering. The nightmares were a reminder that the executioner could not escape his work, not even in sleep. The scaffold followed him into his dreams, into the most private, vulnerable part of his existence. He was haunted, not by ghosts, but by his own memories, his own actions, his own guilt. And there was no exorcism, no ritual, no prayer that could drive them away. The nightmares were part of him, woven into the fabric of his being, and they would be with him until the day he died. The executioner's sense of identity was fractured, fragmented, a puzzle that could never be fully assembled. He was many things at once, a man, a father, a husband, a professional, a pariah. And these roles were in constant conflict, pulling him in different directions, tearing him apart. He could not be fully human because his work dehumanized him. He could not be fully a professional because his profession was despised. He could not be fully a member of society because society rejected him. He existed in a state of perpetual contradiction, a man who was and was not, who belonged and did not belong, who lived and yet was already dead in the eyes of the world. When he looked in the mirror, what did he see? Did he see a man doing his duty, serving justice, maintaining order? Or did he see a monster, a killer, a man whose hands were stained with blood? The answer was probably both, and neither. He saw a stranger, someone he no longer recognized, someone who had been transformed by his work into something other than what he had been, something other than what he wanted to be. The executioner's identity was also shaped by the expectations of others. To the judges and magistrates, he was a tool, an instrument to be used and discarded. To the crowd, he was a spectacle, a figure of fear and fascination. To his family, he was a provider, a protector, but also a source of shame, a reminder of their cursed status. To the condemned, he was death itself, the final face they would see before the end. And to himself, he was a man trying to survive, trying to make sense of a life that made no sense, trying to hold on to some shred of humanity in a world that denied him that humanity at every turn. Some executioners tried to construct an identity around their work, to take pride in their skill, to see themselves as professionals, as craftsmen of death. They honed their techniques, took care of their tools, performed their duties with precision and efficiency. They told themselves that they were good at what they did, that they were necessary, that they served a purpose. This was a way of coping, of finding meaning in the meaningless, of asserting some measure of control over a life that was largely beyond their control. But this professional identity was fragile, constantly undermined by the reality of their social position. No matter how skilled they were, no matter how efficiently they performed, they were still executioners, still pariahs, still despised. Their skill did not earn them respect. It only made them more effective instruments of violence. And deep down, they knew this. They knew that their professional pride was a fiction, a story they told themselves to avoid confronting the truth of what they were. Others rejected the role entirely, at least internally. They saw themselves as victims, as men who had been forced into a profession they did not choose, who were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. They resented the judges who gave the orders, the society that demanded their services, the system that used them and then cast them aside. They were angry, bitter, filled with a rage that had no outlet, no target, no resolution. They performed their duties, but they did so with a sense of alienation, of disconnection, as if they were watching themselves from a distance, as if the man on the scaffold was someone else, a stranger they did not know and did not want to know. And then there were the executioners who simply gave up on identity altogether, who stopped trying to make sense of who they were or what they did. They became hollow, empty, going through the motions of life without any real sense of self. They were automatons, machines, performing their functions with mechanical efficiency but no consciousness, no awareness, no feeling. They had shut down, retreated so far inside themselves that there was nothing left on the surface, just a shell, a mask, a role played without conviction or belief. The executioner's fractured identity was perhaps the most insidious aspect of his nightmare. He could not be whole, could not integrate the different parts of himself into a coherent self. He was always divided, always at war with himself, always struggling to reconcile the man he wanted to be with, the man he was forced to be. And in the end, he often lost that struggle, surrendering to the role, becoming the executioner not just in name but in essence, until there was nothing left of the man he had once been. The executioner's relationship with his wife was shaped by the same forces that shaped every other aspect of his life: isolation, stigma, and the weight of his profession. If he was fortunate enough to find a wife, she was usually the daughter of another executioner, a woman who understood the life because she had been born into it. These marriages were practical arrangements, unions of necessity rather than love, though love could sometimes grow in the cracks, in the quiet moments when the weight of the world lifted, if only briefly. The executioner's wife lived in the same shadow as her husband. She was marked by his profession, tainted by association. Other women would not speak to her, would not invite her to gatherings, would not allow their children to play with hers. She was isolated, just as he was, trapped in a life she had not chosen but could not escape. She managed the household, raised the children, and tried to create some semblance of normalcy in a world that was anything but normal. She also bore the burden of her husband's emotional state. He came home from the scaffold carrying the weight of what he had done, and she was the one who had to deal with the aftermath. She saw his nightmares, his drinking, his silences. She tried to comfort him, to ease his pain, but there was little she could do. She could not undo what he had done, could not erase the memories, could not lift the curse. She could only be there, a presence in the darkness, a reminder that he was not entirely alone. Some wives became hardened, developing their own emotional armor to protect themselves from the horror of their husband's work. They learned not to ask questions, not to probe too deeply, not to let themselves feel too much. They focused on the practical, keeping the house, feeding the children, managing the money. They became efficient, competent, emotionally distant. It was a survival strategy, a way of coping with a life that was unbearable if you thought about it too much. Others were more empathetic, more attuned to their husband's suffering. They tried to be a source of comfort, of warmth, of humanity in a world that denied him those things. They held him when he woke from nightmares, listened when he needed to talk, offered silent companionship when words were inadequate. They were his anchor, the one person who saw him as a man rather than a monster, who loved him despite what he did, or perhaps because of what he endured. But even in the best marriages, there was a distance, a gap that could not be fully bridged. The executioner's wife could sympathize, could support, but she could not truly understand what it was like to stand on the scaffold, to hold the axe, to take a life. That experience was his alone, and it set him apart even from the person closest to him. He was isolated even in intimacy, alone even in the presence of the one who loved him. The executioner's wife also had to manage the practical consequences of his profession. She dealt with the merchants who were reluctant to sell to them, the neighbors who shunned them, the children who came home crying because they had been bullied. She navigated the social landscape with care, trying to minimize conflict, to avoid drawing attention, to keep the family safe. It was a constant balancing act, a daily struggle to maintain some measure of dignity and stability in a life that was inherently unstable. And she lived with the fear that her husband would be injured or killed, that a botched execution would lead to a riot, that the crowd would turn on him and she would be left alone, a widow with children to raise and no means of support. The executioner's profession was dangerous, not just psychologically, but physically. He worked with sharp tools, with hostile crowds, with condemned criminals who might lash out in desperation. Every time he left for the scaffold, there was a chance he would not come back. The executioner's wife was, in many ways, as much a victim of the profession as her husband. She did not choose this life, but she was trapped in it, bound by marriage and circumstance. She endured the isolation, the stigma, the fear, and the sorrow. She was the silent partner in the nightmare, the one who held the family together even as the world tried to tear it apart. And her story, like so many aspects of the executioner's life, has been largely forgotten, lost in the shadows of history. The executioner's relationship with alcohol was often a desperate attempt at self-medication, a way of numbing the pain, of silencing the voices, of escaping, however briefly, from the nightmare of his existence. Alcohol was readily available in the medieval world, and it was one of the few comforts accessible to a man of his station. Ale, beer, wine, these were not luxuries but staples, consumed daily by people of all classes. But for the executioner, alcohol was more than sustenance or refreshment. It was oblivion. After an execution, the executioner would often head straight to the tavern, if he was allowed entry, or drink alone at home. He would drink to forget the face of the condemned, the sound of the crowd, the weight of the axe in his hands. He would drink until the memories blurred, until the guilt receded, until he could no longer think clearly enough to torment himself. It was a temporary reprieve, a few hours of numbness before the cycle began again. But alcohol was a treacherous ally. It offered relief, but it also deepened the problem. The more he drank, the more he needed to drink to achieve the same effect. Tolerance built up, and what had once been a few cups became a bottle, then two, then more. He would wake with a pounding head, a queasy stomach, a sense of shame and self-loathing that was even worse than before. And the only way to quiet that shame was to drink again, starting the cycle anew. Chronic drinking took a toll on his body. His liver struggled, his stomach rebelled, his hands shook. He aged prematurely, his face bloated and red, his eyes bloodshot. He became unreliable, his performance on the scaffold suffering as his coordination and judgment deteriorated. A drunk executioner was a dangerous executioner, more likely to botch an execution, to injure himself, to provoke the crowd. But he could not stop. The alcohol had become as necessary as air, a crutch without which he could not function. His drinking also affected his family. Money that should have gone to food or clothing was spent on ale. He became irritable, unpredictable, prone to outbursts of anger or despair. His wife and children learned to avoid him when he was drunk, to stay out of his way, to wait for the storm to pass. The house became a place of tension and fear, the executioner's drinking adding another layer of misery to an already miserable existence. Some executioners drank themselves to death, their bodies finally giving out under the strain. They died young, their livers failing, their hearts stopping, their systems shutting down. It was a slow suicide, a way of escaping the nightmare without the stigma of taking one's own life. And when they died, they were buried without ceremony, without mourning. Just another executioner gone, replaced by the next in line. Others managed to maintain a precarious balance, drinking enough to cope, but not so much that they could not function. They walked a tightrope, always on the edge of collapse but never quite falling. They were functional alcoholics, men who performed their duties while slowly poisoning themselves, who held their families together while falling apart inside. It was a grim existence, but it was survival, and survival was all they had. The executioner's relationship with alcohol was a symptom of a deeper problem, the unbearable nature of his existence, the lack of any other outlet for his pain, the absence of support or understanding. He drank because he had no other way to cope, because the world offered him no comfort, no solace, no hope. And so he turned to the bottle, seeking in its depths a temporary escape from a nightmare that would never end. The executioner's interactions with the medical profession were limited and often fraught with the same stigma that defined every other aspect of his life. When he was injured or ill, he could not simply visit a physician or surgeon. Many medical practitioners refused to treat him, considering him unclean, cursed, or simply beneath their dignity. He was left to fend for himself, to rely on folk remedies, herbal treatments, or the dubious skills of barber surgeons who were willing to work with anyone, regardless of status. Ironically, the executioner often possessed a certain amount of medical knowledge himself. His work required an understanding of human anatomy, of where to cut, where to strike, how to inflict pain without causing immediate death. He knew the body intimately, in a way that few others did, and this knowledge sometimes translated into a secondary role as a healer or bone setter. In some regions, executioners were called upon to treat dislocations, set broken bones, or even perform minor surgeries. It was a strange inversion. The man who killed also healed. The man who inflicted pain also relieved it. But this medical role was always secondary, always tainted by his primary profession. People came to him out of desperation, when no one else was available, or when they could not afford a proper physician. They did not trust him, did not respect him, but they used him because they had no other choice. And the executioner, for his part, performed these services with the same detachment he brought to his executions. He set the bone, applied the poultice, and sent the patient on their way, knowing that they would never thank him, never acknowledge him, never see him as anything other than what he was. The executioner's own health was often neglected. He worked through pain, through illness, through injury, because he could not afford to stop. There was no sick leave, no disability pay, no safety net. If he could not work, he did not earn, and his family suffered. So he pushed through, ignoring the warning signs, the aches and pains that signaled deeper problems. He treated himself as he treated his tools, something to be used until it broke, and then discarded. When he did fall seriously ill, the consequences were dire. Without access to proper medical care, minor ailments could become life-threatening. An infected wound could lead to sepsis, a fever could spiral out of control, a chronic condition could worsen until it was debilitating. The executioner's life expectancy was not long, shortened by the physical and psychological toll of his work, by the lack of medical care, by the stress and the drinking and the isolation. And when he died, there was no grand funeral, no mourning, no recognition of his service. He was buried quickly, quietly, often in unconsecrated ground, his grave unmarked. His family might grieve, but the community did not. To them, he was just another executioner, gone and forgotten, replaced by the next man in line. His death was a relief, a problem solved, a position vacated, and the cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. The executioner's experience of time was distorted, stretched, and compressed by the nature of his work. The moments on the scaffold were both eternal and instantaneous. The seconds before the axe fell seemed to last forever, every detail seared into his memory with painful clarity. Yet the act itself was over in a flash, a single motion that ended a life and changed his own. Time became a series of these moments, punctuated by long stretches of waiting, of dread, of anticipation. Between executions, time dragged. Days blurred together, each one much like the last, filled with the mundane tasks of survival, eating, sleeping, maintaining his tools, managing his household. But beneath the surface, there was always the knowledge that another execution was coming, that he would have to climb the scaffold again, that the cycle would repeat. This anticipation created a constant low-level anxiety, a sense of dread that never fully dissipated. He could not relax, could not enjoy the present, because the future was always looming, always threatening. And yet, paradoxically, the years passed quickly. Looking back, the executioner might struggle to remember individual executions, individual faces. They blended together into a single, undifferentiated mass of death and suffering. He had killed so many, performed so many executions, that they lost their individuality, became just numbers, just tasks completed. Time collapsed, and he found himself an old man, looking back on a life that seemed both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. The executioner's sense of the future was also distorted. He could not plan, could not hope, could not imagine a life beyond the scaffold. His future was predetermined. More executions, more death, until he was too old or too broken to continue, and then he would be replaced. There was no retirement, no golden years, no peaceful end. There was only the work, and then the end of the work, and then death. The future was a blank, a void, and he could not see beyond it. This temporal distortion affected his relationships, his sense of self, his ability to find meaning in his life. He lived in a perpetual present, haunted by the past, unable to imagine a future. He was trapped in time, just as he was trapped in his profession, unable to move forward, unable to escape. And this temporal prison was yet another layer of the nightmare, another way in which his existence was fundamentally different from that of ordinary people, who could plan, hope, dream, imagine a better tomorrow. The executioner's experience of public festivals and holidays was marked by exclusion and isolation. While the rest of the community gathered to celebrate, to feast, to enjoy the rare moments of joy and communal bonding, the executioner was left on the margins, watching from a distance, unable to participate. He was not welcome at the feast, not invited to the dance, not included in the rituals that bound the community together. On feast days, when the town square filled with music and laughter, the executioner might stand at the edge of the crowd, observing but not joining. He could see the families gathered together, the children playing, the couples dancing. He could smell the roasting meat, the fresh bread, the spiced wine, but he could not partake. If he tried to approach, people would move away, would create a space around him, a bubble of isolation that followed him wherever he went. Religious holidays were particularly painful. These were times when the community came together to worship, to reaffirm their faith, to seek God's blessing. But the executioner was barred from full participation. He could not take communion, could not join in the processions, could not stand with the other men in the church. He was relegated to the back, to the shadows, a reminder of sin and death in a celebration of life and redemption. Some executioners stopped attending festivals altogether, finding the exclusion too painful to bear. They stayed home, alone or with their families, trying to create their own small celebrations, their own moments of joy. But these were pale imitations of the communal festivities, and they only served to highlight the executioner's isolation, his separation from the rest of humanity. Others attended out of a stubborn refusal to be completely erased, to be rendered invisible. They stood at the edges, silent and watchful, asserting their presence even if they could not participate. It was a small act of defiance, a way of saying, I am here, I exist. You cannot pretend I do not. But it was also a form of self-torture, a constant reminder of what they could not have, of the community they could never join. The exclusion from festivals and holidays was more than just a social slight. It was a denial of the executioner's humanity, a refusal to acknowledge him as a full member of the community. Festivals were times when social bonds were reinforced, when people came together to celebrate their shared identity, their common values. By excluding the executioner, the community was saying, you are not one of us. You do not belong. And this message, repeated over and over, year after year, festival after festival, wore away at the executioner's sense of self, his sense of worth, his sense of belonging to the human race. The executioner's experience of aging was accelerated and brutal. The physical and psychological toll of his work aged him prematurely, leaving him an old man while still in his middle years. His body broke down under the strain, his back bent, his hands gnarled, his face lined and weathered. He moved slowly, painfully, each step a reminder of the years of labor, of the countless executions, of the weight he had carried. But it was not just his body that aged. His spirit, too, grew old and tired. The fire that might have burned in his youth, the anger, the defiance, the hope, was extinguished, replaced by a weary resignation. He had seen too much, done too much, endured too much. He was worn down, hollowed out, a shell of the man he might have been. As he aged, the executioner's position became increasingly precarious. His skills, once sharp and reliable, began to decline. His hands shook, his vision blurred, his strength waned. He could no longer swing the axe with the same force, could no longer perform his duties with the same precision. And the community, which had tolerated him only because he was useful, began to lose patience. A botched execution was bad enough when performed by a young, capable executioner. When performed by an old, failing one, it was unforgivable. The executioner knew that his time was running out. He could feel his body failing, could see the younger generation waiting in the wings, ready to take his place. His own son, perhaps, trained and prepared, eager or resigned to step into the role. The executioner's replacement was not a retirement. It was an erasure. Once he could no longer perform, he ceased to have value, ceased to have a purpose. He became a burden, a relic, a reminder of the past that no one wanted to acknowledge. Some executioners tried to hold on as long as possible, clinging to their position out of fear of what would come after. Without the work, who were they? What would they do? How would they survive? The work had defined them for so long that they could not imagine life without it. So they continued, even as their bodies failed, even as the executions became more difficult, more painful, more dangerous. They pushed themselves beyond their limits, driven by desperation and fear. Others welcomed the end, seeing it as a release from the nightmare. They trained their replacement, handed over the tools, and stepped aside with a sense of relief. They had done their duty, had served their time, and now they could rest. But the rest was not peaceful. They were still marked, still tainted, still executioners in the eyes of the world. They might no longer perform executions, but they could not escape the identity, the stigma, the curse. And when the old executioner finally died, there was no ceremony, no recognition, no gratitude. He was buried quickly, quietly, his grave unmarked or marked only with a simple stone. His name was forgotten, his life reduced to a footnote, a statistic, a role filled and then vacated. He had lived a nightmare, and he died in obscurity, leaving behind only the faint echo of the axe falling, the rope tightening, the crowd's roar fading into silence. The executioner's legacy was one of absence and erasure. He left behind no monuments, no memorials, no records of his thoughts or feelings. His story was told by others, by judges who recorded the sentences, by chroniclers who noted the executions, by moralists who used him as a symbol of sin and punishment. But his own voice was silent, lost to history, buried beneath layers of stigma and shame. His children inherited his profession and his curse, perpetuating the cycle into the next generation. They carried his name, his tools, his burden, but they did not carry his memory, not in any meaningful sense. The executioner was not remembered as a person, as an individual with hopes and dreams and fears. He was remembered only as a role, a function, a necessary evil. In some regions, the executioner's house was left standing after his death, a grim landmark that marked the boundary between the respectable and the disreputable. It became a place of superstition and fear, a house that no one wanted to enter, that children dared each other to approach. It was a monument not to the man, but to the profession, a reminder of the violence that underpinned the social order. In other regions, the house was torn down, the site cleared, the memory erased. The community wanted to forget, to move on, to pretend that the executioner had never existed. And so his home was destroyed, his possessions scattered, his name struck from the records. He was unmade, rendered invisible, as if he had never been. The executioner's legacy was also one of silence. He could not speak of his experiences, could not share his story, could not seek understanding or sympathy. He was expected to carry his burden alone, in silence, without complaint. And so his voice was never heard, his perspective never recorded, his humanity never acknowledged. He was a ghost, a shadow, a figure that haunted the edges of history, but never stepped into the light. And yet, in a strange way, the executioner's legacy endures. He is a symbol, a reminder of the violence that societies inflict in the name of justice, of the individuals who are sacrificed to maintain order, of the costs that are borne by those who do the work that no one else will do. He is a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of scapegoating, of dehumanization, of creating a class of people who are marked as other, as less than human. The executioner's nightmare did not end with his death. It continued, passed down through generations, woven into the fabric of society, a dark thread that runs through history, connecting past to present, reminding us that the machinery of justice has always required someone to turn the wheel, to pull the lever, to swing the axe, and that someone has always paid a terrible price. So there it is. The life of a medieval executioner was not a tale of power or prestige. It was a living nightmare, a curse that marked a man from birth to death, that isolated him from his community, that destroyed his body and his spirit, that left him haunted and hollow. He was necessary, yes, but he was also despised, feared, and ultimately forgotten. He lived in the shadows, performed his grim duties, and died in obscurity, leaving behind only the faint echo of the axe falling, the rope tightening, the crowd's roar fading into silence. The executioner's story is a reminder that history is not just made by kings and heroes, but also by the forgotten, the marginalized, the cursed. It is a reminder that the machinery of justice has always required someone to do the dirty work, and that someone has always paid a terrible price. And it is a reminder that we should never forget the human cost of the systems we create, the individuals who are sacrificed in the name of order, the lives that are destroyed so that others can feel safe. The medieval executioner lived a nightmare, and his story, though buried in the past, still has the power to haunt us today.